we live in rather dismal times. Even Thomas Friedman, a professional optimist, seems miserable these days. He just wrote a piece, his weekly piece in the New York Times, about how we've lost our moorings as a society. And there's this rather dismal American flag at half-mast. So we need some lessons in liberty. And indeed, we have those today with my guest, Jeremy S. Adams, remarkable fellow, not just an author, popular author, best-selling author, but also a high school teacher in Bakersfield, California. And he has a new book out, Lessons in Liberty, 30 Rules for Living from 10 Extraordinary Americans. And Scott is joining us from Bakersfield, California. Jeremy, do you note the rather dismal atmosphere in America these days? Is it just Thomas Friedman, or is everyone down on the Republic?
No, I think that cynicism is the theory of the day. There's no question about it. And you know, one of the things about teaching, as long as I have, tomorrow is the end of my 26th year teaching. So as my students like to say when they want to make me feel old, I've been teaching for over a quarter of a century. You know, one of the things about that is when something changes, and it changes quickly, and there's a fast pivot in the way that young people think and act and behave, I'm going to notice it. And I've really noticed in the last 3 or 4 years a kind of, I would say a kind of fatalism, a kind of cynicism, a pessimism that has really infected and plagued the outlook of my young people. Again, I'm one of these bleeding heart romantics when it comes to America and it comes to the classroom. But I will tell you that their view of their country and their view of themselves and their potential to have meaningful lives has really diminished quite significantly in the last 4 or 5 years, which is really why I was so inspired and motivated to write the book.
Although, Jeremy, your last book, which was a bestseller, Hollowed Out, a warning about America's next generation, perhaps has caused some of this pessimism. You haven't always been quite as optimistic. Perhaps you've only just found your rose-tinted spectacles.
No, actually, you know, it's interesting because Hollowed Out was pretty much pure description of the problem. You know, one of the cool things about being a public school teacher, you're not famous, you're not rich, you're not going to get a lot of accolades. But the one really cool thing about it is you do see things before everybody else does. And I'm going to toot my own horn here for a minute because you know, having 3 children.
Don't be shy, Jeremy. Yeah, that's why you come on this show to toot your own horn.
Well, hey, man, I have 3 children and I teach, you know, 170 seniors a day. So nobody else is tooting my own horn. I might as well do it. You know, when Hollowed Out came out 3 years ago, and I was talking about the fact that, look, there's a problem in the way that young people are living their lives. They are untethered to adult values. They don't know much about the country. They don't know anything about religion. They don't want to get married. They're unhappy. Their mental health.
Apparently, Jeremy, they're not even having sex anymore.
No, and we can talk about that. So I was saying, look, guys, there's a real problem here. And I remember 3 years ago, I was called a right-wing, you know, nut job, this ideological, and I didn't think I was making any kind of a liberal or conservative argument. I was just saying, look, I'm standing at the intersection of politics and culture and technology, and I'm telling you what's coming down the pike is not good. And now the New York Times is talking about mental health, and we have bestsellers called The Anxious Generation, and everybody's talking about this now, and the monomaniacal obsession with phones and the lack of patriotism, and nobody wants to get busy, as you said, you know, and have children and get married and date. And I was calling this years ago, and I knew it was happening because I saw it in the classroom, and now everybody's seeing it. So really this book is about, well, what do we do about it? Because those things are still there, but now this book is a question of, well, what can we do about all of the problems?
And you wrote a piece recently in the LA Times on the rise of the Zombies. So you saw the Zombies before anyone else in your classroom. Is it, before we get to the, I don't know if it's a fix or a way of addressing it, Jeremy, do you agree with the theories in new bestsellers like The Anxious Generation that it's all because of these smartphones and social networks, or is it more complicated than that?
I think that is a lot of it. I mean, I think there's no question about it. When you look at the data is the data. I mean, something happened around 2013, 2014. You look at the mental health. And I do think there are some things that are absolutely true. that people like John Haidt talk about. There's no question the cell phones have utterly destroyed the attention span of our children. They can't read books. My students can't even go to the movies. I mean, they'll tell you they can't watch movies because they don't want to sit there for an hour and a half. I will tell you that I think in a lot of ways it's destroyed the classroom, because now teachers are expected to kind of use all of the latest gadgets and gizmos instead of being able to have meaningful dialogues and lectures and traditional ways of learning. So I think I blame it for a lot of things. But I would say there was a second piece to it, which is that I do think we live in this kind of era of radical individualism, where a lot of our young people were becoming unmoored from the kind of the habits and the institutions and the relationships that tend to give life its meaning and its purpose. And I think that was already there, but I think that the technology amplified and accelerated it, essentially put it on steroids in a way that really made it come a lot faster than the pike than I think that would have happened had we not had the technology and the cell phones. But I would tell you that I think things have gotten even worse the last 2 or 3 years. They've become, much more political in the way that the young people look at their country and in the way that they look at themselves. I mean, some of the statistics that when you read it, it is so shocking. You have to read it a few times. I mean, the most shocking statistic I've ever heard, came across about a year and a half ago, is that 1 out of 4 18 to 24-year-olds have considered suicide in their lives, which, I mean, I remember what it was like to be young and alive, and you want to do everything and you want to know everything. You want to go everywhere, and you have dreams and passions and all of these wonderful things of life. The embers of your humanity are right there. And to be thinking about killing yourself, something has gone wrong in our culture. Something has gone wrong in our society when you have that kind of a number.
Some people might say these hysterias about young Americans has happened in the past before, certainly around the 1960s. Lots of quote unquote conservative books critiquing young people. Yeah. Is your book that type? You say that you got picked up by the conservatives. I know you write for the Federalist, which is a conservative publication, although you don't consider yourself a conservative. Is this I would say I do. Feature in American life, this concern with young people?
I mean, I think yes and no. First of all, I consider that myself. I'm not really. I wouldn't affiliate myself with a political party anymore. I used to, probably not anymore. I do think that I have a conservative disposition. I think a lot of my views are conservative, but only in the sense that I believe that a lot of the habits and the values and the institutions that allow us to have meaningful lives and a successful civilization need to be conserved. In that way, I am definitely a conservative. And let me talk about. You asked a great question. Isn't this just the same thing we hear all the time? Worried about the kids, go all the way back to Greece. And I'll be honest, I don't know the word, but there's a Greek word that people use to talk about, thinking
the Greek word for everything, Jeremy.
Yeah, I know. Well, yeah, but this one is pretty popular. But something is different. And what's different is two things. One is the cynicism that young people have about their country today. That is new. And the other thing that is new is when you look at the levels of depression and loneliness and self-harm and hospitalization, eating disorders, all of these things are new. This isn't just in the 1960s. This isn't ancient Greece. This is something that is uniquely bad about our time. And I think if we're not being honest about it, we're sure as heck not going to be able to solve it.
Jeremy, some people might be listening to you and saying, well, that's true. And young people might say, that's true. And it's justified. America now is a country of enormous economic inequality. Some people would argue deep racism, sexism, hostility, breakdown of civic discourse, support for Israel over Gaza, which for some people undermines all the core values of Americanness. Yeah. Is America in 2024 objectively, you're a relatively objective fellow as a teacher, is it in more crisis, leaving aside the problems of kids, which we'll talk about later, but is it in a worse state in terms of its values and its actuality?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably go the absolute opposite direction of that. I actually think if you didn't know if you were black or white, gay or straight, northern, southern, didn't know what religion you were born into your family, and you had to be born into a specific place and a specific time in all of human history, and you wanted to make sure that you had freedom, and you wanted to make sure that you had opportunity, and you wanted to make sure that you had legal equality, and you wanted to make sure that pluralism was a value that your society upheld as paramount, and you wanted to make it so that you probably weren't going to die in a war or a famine, you would probably choose to be born, at least in a Western society today. And so I think when you look at it through the long lens of human history, I think it is absolutely folly to say that we are living through the worst of times. And frankly, I would tell you that there's a potent dish of presentism that somebody is eating if that's what they're really, what they really think. Now, that is not to say we don't have problems. We do. I think the environment is a problem. I think that I don't worry so much about income inequality. I do worry about a lack of social mobility. Why does Finland have more social mobility than we do? Why is the number one predictor in America of being poor that your parents were poor? I mean, we can go on and on and on about the problems of our society, but that's taking a microscope to it. And we should talk about those things, and we should try and solve those things. But the broad level of cynicism, this idea that America is not just a country that has a dark history and problems and sins, because we do, but the fact that we can never get on with it, the fact that we can never improve it, the fact that it defines who we are, it's in our DNA. That is what I take exception to, and that's where I think a lot of young people believe.
What about the American dream, Jeremy? We've done many shows on the end, the death, the crisis of the American dream. You talked about mobility. You got kids in your class at Bakersfield. I know that you've got a good variety of kids, some wealthy, some less wealthy. It costs 70, 80,000. We were talking before we went live about our own kids at fancy schools and how we got to work till we're 85 because of the school fees. It costs 70, 80, 100,000 now a year to send a kid to a decent school. Doesn't that speak of the crisis of the American dream?
I'm not. Yeah, there's a problem. I mean, we can sit here and talk all day. I mean, if you, I can talk about any of these problems. I mean, I live in California, where I think, when you have costs of you can't build homes, we energy is expensive, college is expensive, renewing your license is expensive. It goes on and on. But I think what I'm talking about not so much is kind of all the different problems of public policy that we constantly have to be vigilant about. I'm talking about a broad civilizational belief that your society isn't going to give you a fair shake. That if you work hard and you play by the rules, that you still aren't going to be rewarded. And I'll tell you, I mean, at the end of the day, yes, my students worry me a lot, but they also give me a lot of hope. As you mentioned, and I want to make this point very, very clear. I teach a lot of students who come from the bottom side of luck. I mean, almost no economic opportunity, not the best schools, a single parent who works many jobs. And yet a lot of those kids, they put their head down. They know they have a chance for a free education. They know there are a lot of programs out there that can help them succeed when it comes to getting scholarships, to getting Cal Grants. And yet they do the right thing, and because they believe that they are in control of their own lives. And that to me is the biggest problem I see with a lot of kind of these broad levels of distrust of the American creed and the American dream, is this idea that these larger forces are at play and that truly I'm not free, that I don't have any agency. And yet I'm telling you right now, I've been in the classroom for 26 years, and kids who believe that they have control over their lives, kids who believe that tomorrow can be better than today, who understand that education is the key to getting to college, which is the key to so much in life. I see the magic happen all the time, man. I don't have to go to Disneyland to see magic. I see it in a lot of my young people. They are the walking embodiment of the American dream, and they can do it, but they have to believe they can first.
And of course, some of that belief comes from their teacher. One of your books, I think the book before the last, was called The Secrets of Timeless Teachers. This new book, Lessons in Liberty, 30 Rules for Living from 10 Extraordinary Americans, doesn't include a formal teacher. Some people might be listening to this, Jeremy, and learning more about you, thinking, here's an extraordinary American. Now, why didn't you include a formal teacher? And do you consider yourself an extraordinary American?
I consider myself to be an extraordinary lover of America. You know, at the I have 3 kids and
I thought you were going
100.
to say extraordinary lover, but just of America.
No, I will not
Gotta be
touch that
careful
one.
with that, Jeremy.
Yeah, I
You'll
will.
lose
Yeah,
your job.
yeah. I won't touch that. So I'm at the end of the school year, so I don't feel like I'm an extraordinary anything right now. That being said, though, one of the 10 people in the book was a teacher, Clara Barton.
Yes.
An incredible American. You know, Clara Barton. The reason why I love
Although
her
she's
so
most
much,
famous as a nurse. I mean.
right? Yes, and founder of the American Red Cross, and as a nurse. And in the book, I talk about. I mean, I could go on and on about Clara Barton. I mean, the fact that she revolutionized nursing in the Civil War, because what she figured out was men who have to languish out in the battlefield and wait for the ambulances and wait for them, they die out there, and their infections get bad, and they have all these camps teeming with vermin. And she figured out if you go to them as soon as they were in, as soon as possible, the survival rates just shot up. And so it's she's one of these, and she had so much courage. I mean, she would go out into the battlefield and she would have bullets going through her. I mean, she's just an incredible woman of potent bravery and patriotism. But she was also, but before she did that, she was a teacher. And she came from Massachusetts. John Adams famously was a big believer in public education all the way back in the 1780s. And so she grew up with this idea that everybody should be educated, but America didn't start off that way. And she really popularized that in other places, opening up schools, saying it doesn't matter where you come from. Everybody deserves a quality education. Again, those ideas came from somewhere. That came from somebody who popularized it. I have so much admiration for her. And that's one of the lessons of liberty we should all kind of aspire to, is this idea that if you see a problem in this country, one of the blessings of freedom is you have the freedom to go solve it. Stop saying that it's somebody else's problem all the time. If you see a problem, feel free to gather like-minded individuals and citizens and do something about it. She did, and we should admire her for it.
Well, we'll get to those 10 or perhaps 9 other with Clara Barton after the break. But coming back to the issue of teachers, Jeremy, you're clearly an extraordinary teacher if you perform at even 10% of what you're doing today. I'm going to come and sit in your class.
You're welcome to come in. Yeah.
Is one of the problems with America that teachers and the teaching profession is not rewarded? Everyone might want to be a professor at Harvard or Princeton, although perhaps less so these days because of all the scandals there. But is one problem with America that we're not rewarding extraordinary men and women who want to become teachers and pass on their skills, their enthusiasm, their wisdom to younger people?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right and that's something that I've noticed for a long time. When you look at other countries, the stature of teacher.
Finland in particular, I think lots of comparisons. You mentioned Finland earlier.
Yeah, Finland, Singapore, South Korea. These are jobs that people put up on pedestals. And I think at the end of the day, we are all products of our culture and our society. And if the wealthiest and the most adulated and celebrated people do A, B, and C, then the most capable of us are going to go do A, B, and C. It's funny you mentioned this because, I started teaching so long ago. I can remember when everybody wanted to be a lawyer. I remember when The Firm came out and you had the John Grisham novels. And then it became computer science, and now it's engineering. And our students just kind of reflect that. They want to go to where the prestige is. And I get that. And so I think you're absolutely right. In a democratic society, education is the key to self-government. And if we don't have an educated population, and if we don't have the best and the brightest going into education, then the American idea is not going to endure. I mean, no disrespect to Congress or to the president or to state government. They are all very important. But if you want to know where democracy is renewed, it's renewed in the classroom. It's renewed in the schools. That's where it's renewed. And if you don't have habits that help you be successful at school, and if you don't learn what this country is about, I don't know how the democratic experiment can endure very long.
And is it really a question, Jeremy, of ultimately of money? You're a best-selling author. I know you also teach college. Your wife is in commerce. Can people survive as teachers?
I think it depends on where you are. I mean, for instance, I'm very blessed to be a California teacher living in Bakersfield, where it's pretty cheap. I think things would be, I think it'd be a lot harder for me to be a teacher if I lived up where you lived in the Bay Area.
Yeah, in San Francisco, right? Where I am. I mean, the narrative is that teachers and firemen and policemen, they simply can't live in the city anymore. And I think it's true.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, again, we could have a whole conversation about the problem of California is that there really are just two Californias. I mean, you have, the very, very wealthy who can enjoy the bounty of living a California lifestyle. And you have this huge underclass of people in California, a lot of rich and a lot of very poor. And I think that it's sad that teachers feel like, I mean, again, this is going to sound bad, but I teach really bright kids. And when I ask them, hey, what do you want to do with your life? Very few say teaching, and you ask why, and it's because there's a certain lifestyle that they want to have. And also, by the way, if I lived in South Dakota, if I lived in the Midwest, it would be very hard to have much of a life as a teacher. So I think that's part of it. You're absolutely right.
We're speaking with Jeremy S. Adams, star teacher, star writer, the author of a new book, Lessons in Liberty, 30 Rules for Living from 10 Extraordinary Americans. I think Jeremy will be most entertained by our friends at Liberty, a quarterly of culture and politics. All our guests get an annual subscription, dealing in some ways with the same issues that Jeremy addresses in the book. Going to run a short ad for Liberties, and then we'll be back with Jeremy S. Adams to talk about the 10 extraordinary Americans who offer in his new book, Lessons in Liberty. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We're speaking with one of California's best teachers, and that's not just me exaggerating. I think you won the Best Teacher of the Year award, Jeremy, one year?
I was the Daughters of the American Revolution State Teacher of the Year. I was a Department of Education semifinalist of the year. And I obviously won the Kern County Teacher of the Year award too. So I've been pretty lucky.
You win the Keenan Teacher of the Year award.
Yay! I'll take it. So
you've got this new book, Lessons in Liberty, 30 Rules for Living from 10 Extraordinary Americans. We're going to get to those extraordinary Americans in a minute. Most people will have heard of all of them, all remarkable in their own way. But my question for you in this kind of project, I'm sure everyone's asked you this, how did you choose these 10 extraordinary Americans? Because there are many extraordinary Americans, many that everyone will disagree with your list. Someone will say, oh, this person deserves to be on more than somebody else. How did you come up with this list?
Well, as you point out, I mean, the problem was not coming up with 10. It's how do you only find 10, right? How do you figure out the correct 10? And the most important thing to me is I wanted to make it very clear that this is not a liberal book or a conservative book. I wanted it to be an American book so that we have people from all walks of life, all eras of our history, men and women, people from all racial backgrounds, religious points of view, intellectual propensities, all of these things. And so, the point there is that our country is big enough and rich enough and splendid enough that you have all kinds of people from the kind of national mosaic that we are who have been able to live successful American lives. And so I didn't just want to have founding fathers. I didn't just want to have 20th century or men or women. I wanted people from a rich variety of backgrounds who could really model what it's like to use liberty and use it in a meaningful way so that people can experience joy and enchantment and grandeur and help to renew the American experiment as well.
Subtitle of the book is 30 Rules for Living. We've got a show in a week or two with an Australian political theorist who's written a book about liberalism, small l, as a way of life. Is that what you're arguing? And that liberty is not theory, it's the practice of living, and that these 10 individuals all offer lessons in how to live a good life?
That is exactly right. I think that if you believe in classical liberalism the way that I do, I'm an ardent believer in kind of the Jeffersonian, Lockean vision of society. It's not perfect, but
Jefferson, of course, is not on the list, Jeremy. I'm sure some people will be arguing on that one.
No, he's in there. He's one of the 10. He's one
Jefferson?
of the 10. Jefferson is one there, yeah.
Wow, I didn't realize.
Yeah, chapter 4. But you identified something that's so important, and I hope your audience can appreciate this, which is that it's one thing. It's easy to, quote the Declaration of Independence. It's easy to quote the Gettysburg Address. It's easy to carry on about freedom and liberty, and everybody has a right to it. It's one thing to say that everybody deserves freedom, which I ardently believe. The problem is that just because you have freedom doesn't mean that you know how to use it well, and doesn't mean that you know how to use it in a meaningful way. And in order to do that, you need to attach freedom and liberty to things like wisdom and education and guidance and morality and virtue. All of these things have to be attached to freedom, because if they're not, then freedom becomes chaos, liberty becomes licentiousness. And when you look at our cities and you look at our schools and you look at the lives of a lot of people today, they're free, but they're not wise. And that's really, this book, let me be honest, it's practical. It's an actionable book. It's to say, look, you're free, Americans, but you're so unhappy with your lives. You clearly don't know how to use your freedom well. Well, look right behind you. Look in the rearview mirror just a little bit. There are these amazing Americans who use their liberty in a way that allowed them to be highly successful, highly fulfilled, leading to human flourishing, making a difference in their community, their country, and their history. How did they do it? How did they live these incredible lives? Because, this is my favorite quote on education comes from the great French essayist Montaigne, who said, I study the thoughts of others to know my own thoughts better. Well, we can study the lives of other Americans before us, and we can steal their habits. We can steal their wisdom. Their values can become our values. And so, this book is really an attempt to solve the problem of unhappiness of our time by using our own history as a guide.
Yeah, I miss Jefferson. I know you had Madison, and of course, this won't be the first or the last time you get the Madison question, and more dramatically the Jefferson question. You talk about these men as extraordinary Americans living principled lives, but of course, Jefferson is also notorious as a slave owner, as the father of many illegitimate children, as a man who was in many ways unprincipled. How do you deal with that critique of Madison also owned slaves?
Washington, yeah,
like Madison and Jefferson, and indeed Washington, who's also on your list.
Yeah, well, I think at the end of the day, what you have to do is you have to be honest. There's no denying that these elements of their biography were there. And I'm not a moral relativist. I think we should call them out. We should talk about, the contradiction in the American soul between the rhetoric of our founding documents and the reality of human bondage for almost 100 years in our shores. There's no question that it is a contradiction, and it's a contradiction in our documents, and it's a contradiction in the life of Thomas Jefferson, which I acknowledge. But here's how I deal with it: is you can't deny it. I have a lot of conservative friends who want to say, well, everybody's a product of their time, and therefore you just kind of have to understand that and move on. No, I'm not willing to give a free pass, but what I would say is that's just not what my book is about. My book is not about what all of these men and women got wrong. The book is about what they got right, and how what they got right can echo today, and it can help us live better lives today. So, again, if you look at the book, it's hopefully very readable. It's not that long. It's 200 pages. And I want to be clear, it's a self-help book. I have a very specific lens that I'm looking at these 10 people with, and that is, what did they do that made them successful that we can steal for our own lives? If this was a full-on biography of all 10 of them, it would be an 8,000-page book. And I don't even pretend to do that. I'm just a high school teacher.
Everyone counts these things, though, Jeremy. You know as well as I do. They'll be looking at this list. There's one black guy on, and he's a male on the list, Arthur Ashe, clearly a remarkable man. Maybe we'll get to him later. But in an America riven with divisions and anger and resentment, do you think you might have included a very distinguished historic African-American? You've got Washington, you've got Madison, you've got Jefferson, you've got Lincoln. So you've got all the white guys. What about Du Bois? What about Frederick Douglass? What about MLK? Yeah,
again, this is where you kind of get to the 10. And it's hard. Frederick Douglass was absolutely on my list. I think you could make the argument that Frederick Douglass is one of the
Rosa Parks.
Rosa Parks. I mean, you could go on and on. I mean, you even have extraordinary Americans today. I mean, there are people who I admire. I think Denzel Washington is one of the most incredible Americans in our culture today. Again, you could go on and on and on and on. And again, trust me, when I looked at the list, it was very, very, very difficult. But I will tell you that I think it's a good list. I mean, I think it's important that we have two Native Americans. One from the Cheyenne tribe, another one who is
Ben Nighthorse.
Ben Nighthorse Campbell, incredible man. He's the only person on the list of 10 who are still alive. He's pretty old at this point, to be honest. Daniel Inouye, who I think is one of these names that every single American should know. I think it's a tragedy that people in Hawaii know him, but beyond that, people don't know that much about him. And yet, if you study his life and what he did for this country and how he fought so hard for a country that didn't treat him well, it is absolutely an inspiring tale. And I'll tell you, I think Arthur Ashe is a great choice. And I think I did.
Tell us about. I mean, Ashe was clearly a man of great nobility. But what's so remarkable about Ashe?
I think what's so great about Arthur, well, first of all, okay, I will admit to some bias here. I love tennis, right? So I'm a huge fan of tennis. So Arthur Ashe, since I was a child, has always been somebody who, in the tennis world, we look up to. The largest tennis stadium in the world is named after him. I'm old enough now that I remember when Davis Cup was actually still a really big deal. And he was the captain of the Davis Cup team. And so, I mean, yes, in many ways, I kind of came to love and revere Arthur Ashe as a tennis player. But one of the great things about this project is, yes, some of the guys on here, I've been teaching for 25 years. I knew Washington and Madison and Jefferson very, very well, though I learned a lot more about them. But people like Ben Nighthorse Campbell and Clara Barton and Arthur Ashe, when you really begin to dig deep, there are so many fascinating stories about them where you realize that this country would not be what it is without these contributions that somehow don't get taught in our schools very often. And Arthur Ashe, he was so criticized for being late to the game when it came to American civil rights. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar called him Arthur Ass. He was at a party in the 1970s and Jesse Jackson got in his face and said, "Your problem, Arthur, is that you're just not arrogant enough." And what I love about Arthur Ashe was he said, "Look, I might have been slow coming to the cause of American civil rights." He felt bad about it later in life. But the great thing about Arthur Ashe is he said, "I'm going to make a difference to the world in my own way. I don't have to be like Kareem. I don't have to be like Muhammad Ali. I don't have to be like Jesse Jackson. I'm Arthur Ashe, and I'm going to do things in the way that I want to." And, so what I love about him was that he is the one who really raised the American consciousness when it comes to the evils of South African apartheid. He really drew nose to that earlier than anybody else, especially in the sports world. And I love that. I think that's a great message for you and me and for everybody, which is, I'm not going to be Washington. I'm not going to be Lincoln. I'm not going to be Barack Obama or Donald Trump. I'm Jeremy Adams. And I have to be comfortable with my character and my
Jeremy
life.
S. Adams.
Jeremy S. Yeah, exactly. Jeremy Adams.
Remember, because I think there's another Jeremy Adams.
There's a comic strip, a guy who does like comic strips or something in Hollywood who's,
you got to have the S, Jeremy.
That you had to.
What does the S stand for, by the way?
Stephen.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah. So I have to say, if your number one goal is to be the number one person on Google of your name, I failed. No question about it. That's why I had to add the S. But I want young people, I want all Americans to kind of be inspired to say, I know what my skill set is. I know what my personality is, but that doesn't mean I can't make a difference to my own community. And this is where I am kind of conservative. Like I do believe that typically the best life, the most fulfilling life is a life where we try to make a difference in our own institutions, in our own communities, in our own churches, our own homes. It's great to be in the history books. It's great to be famous and rich and whatever, I guess. But for 99.9% of us, we have to do what Arthur Ashe does, which is to make a difference in our own way.
Jeremy, you know the classroom a million times better than me. Young people. My sense is that they look for models who reflect their own identities, often ethnic, religious, and also gendered. You've talked about Clara Barton, who's clearly an inspirational figure. The only other woman on the list is Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yeah.
Were you Did you wrestle with other women? Is it just coincidental that of these 10 Americans, only 2 of them are female, 8 men?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, it's the same kind of issue of, you only, if you're only going to get 10, if you're trying to make a very, very readable book. But I did want to make sure that I had women from different centuries and different interests and different dispositions. Ruth
Yeah,
Bader
and RBG and Clara Barton, you couldn't find 2 more different people.
well, but no, actually, what I would argue with that a little bit. They were both like radically individualistic. They were not really worried about what other people thought at times if they thought it was right. I mean, they're both amazingly principled people. And the thing I love about Ginsburg, of course, is that, I think in addition to the fact that she's just an incredible woman that had to deal with so much trauma early on in her marriage. Her husband, Marty, got testicular cancer when he was at Harvard. And what did Ruth Bader Ginsburg do? She stepped up. She went to his classes. She took notes. She helped him with his papers. She was taking care of their young daughter, Jane. And this is before she even got to go to her law school herself. When she goes to Columbia Law School, she graduates #1 in her class. She can't get a job out of law school because the law firms aren't hiring women. I mean, she's just an absolutely incredible woman. And what I loved about the Ginsburg story, what I absolutely loved is that really that marriage is a marriage where they understood that they can achieve each other's dreams if they see each other as a partnership, not as a kind of a zero-sum game. A lot of young people.
What's your take, though? There's raging debate, conservatives and liberals, particularly in this sense, about women's place in the world. Are you 100% feminist? I mean, it's interesting that you women, you pick RBJ and then you start talking about her as a selfless wife.
Well, no, but I didn't get to finish though, which is that her husband understood that that she, had this ultimate, goal of being on the Supreme Court, and they believed in each other. It is a great story where when he was in the hospital for the final time. She looks into the drawer and he writes this amazing love letter to her, essentially. And I have this in the book where he says, the great honor of my life has been to love you. And that's made all the difference in the world. And people forget that, Ruth Bader Ginsburg had to fight like hell to get on the Supreme Court. She's now seen as this liberal icon. And yet in 1993, she was not even on the first list when Bill Clinton decided to nominate somebody to the Supreme Court. And the reason is fascinating, which is that she wasn't seen as being passionate and ardent enough of a supporter of Roe v. Wade. It's one of these little quirks of history that people forget about.
Listening to you, Jeremy, I'm guessing, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the final person we haven't mentioned, Theodore Roosevelt, TR, is perhaps your personal, if not hero, is a man that you would love to emulate, a man of great enthusiasm and remarkable energy. Does TR somehow encapsulate what it means to be an extraordinary American?
I think in a lot of ways he does. I mean, let me be clear. I would love to have a patina, a sliver, a modicum of the incredible capacity, intellectual and moral, of any of the 10 people on this list. So I want to be very clear. I would love to have any of what they have. But I will say that you are right, that there is a kind of passion and enthusiasm and energy that Teddy Roosevelt had that was absolutely superhuman. I mean, he is the eighth wonder of the world. He gives this, I would argue, I think it's probably the greatest American speech that I've ever read, that kind of encapsulates the essence of the American spirit. And it was his Man in the Arena speech, which ironically he doesn't give in America. He gives it in Paris. He gives it at the Sorbonne. And what he says is that real Americans use their liberty to go into the arena. That we are not a country of critics. It's easy to be a critic.
We're doers. Americans are doers.
We're
no
doers.
Greater doer, for better or worse, than TR.
Exactly. Yeah. And again, I mean, this is where I'll be honest. I mean, I'll give you.
You're always honest.
Yeah. My inner psychology is, sometimes I do want to hold back. And I don't want to say something unpopular, or I'm afraid of writing a book that nobody's going to buy and it will be a failure. But then at the end of my days, what am I going to do? I'm going to be sitting there on my deathbed saying, my God, you believed in this. You wanted to have this dream of writing this book or giving this speech or teaching this, and you didn't do it because you were afraid. And frankly, Teddy Roosevelt teaches us not to be afraid, to dare deeply, to reach high, to dream big. That is the essence of America. And if you don't do it, you're cheating yourself and you're cheating your country.
Well, that's what Lessons in Liberty is, according to Jeremy S. Adams, 30 Rules for Living from 10 Extraordinary Americans. I would add Jeremy. I think he is an extraordinary American. 2 final questions, Jeremy, both very unfair, but the way I operate here. Firstly, I'm going to give you one more choice. Who was the 11th person, the 11th man or woman who didn't get in, who you really wrestled with, and when you can't sleep at night, you think to yourself, I wish I'd included that person?
Yeah, Frederick Douglass. I mean, that's easy. Frederick Douglass is somebody who I absolutely revere, somebody who had a tough life in a way that, I mean, obviously started off as an enslaved person. Yeah. But I mean, again, I mean, such a fascinating man. He had so many different chapters of his life that you could take something from each of them, and I think there's just quirks about him that we live in this country that is still largely Christian. Even if people don't go to church, they kind of have the world view. And yet I love the fact that he was always talking about the Old Testament, that's where the wisdom is. And I always thought that was fascinating and quirky, because you don't really see that all that much in our history and in our leaders. I love the fact that he would give crap to anybody, man. He was not going to back down, even to Abraham Lincoln, who he liked and he admired. And so that's the one that honestly, Frederick Douglass was somebody who I just deeply admire. Absolutely.
Well, we can include Douglass. He's the 11th person on the 10-man or 10-woman team. And finally, Jeremy, the really unfair question. And you know what I'm going to ask.
I don't.
30 rules for living from one extraordinary American. If you just had to choose one, who would it be?
This is totally unfair. You know that, right?
I know, it's really unfair.
Totally unfair. You know what? I'm going to. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I'm going to go with an inspired choice that I think is straightforward. And if I don't choose it, it's a lie. The very first lesson in the book from the most indispensable American, George Washington, his very first rule: embrace self-help, right? And that's what the whole spirit of the book is about. The idea that there's never a bad time to be better, that we can always get better in life, that we can always improve, we can get stronger, smarter, wiser, fitter, more learned. And Washington had that ethic. He understood that liberty is not an outcome, it's a way of living. And if you are constantly using your days to become wiser and kinder and better in some fashion or another, then the magical melody of America is something that you can sing. That's really the key to freedom, is to not be stationary, is not to be sedentary, is to always try and have an exciting, vibrant life. And so that's why we need to look back in order to move forward.